Welcome to Deep River Farm. Well, we've been out here pulling the rest of the tomatoes up, getting the beds ready for the fall plant. But I wanted to talk to you today about how to plant by the Almanac. A lot of people's heard of the Almanac, but they've never actually planted by it. Let's talk about some pros and cons of the Almanac. First of all, this particular company, Blum's, has been in business for 196 years. Question would be, if the Almanac works, you can see why they're in business. If it didn't work, they'd have never made it 196 years. The pros of it is, and I'm going to tell you the pros because I believe in the pros, and I'm going to tell you why. Because the Almanac works. The pros are, if you'll go by the Almanac and the signs, what's going to happen is you're going to have a bigger crop, you're going to have better produce. Let's fix that. You're going to have bigger produce, you're going to have more produce, you're going to have healthier plants. They're going to also be stronger. The cons of it is, if you don't go by the Almanac, what's going to happen is you're going to have a good looking garden, but you're going to have very little produce. And I'm going to tell you why, but I've got to explain how the Almanac actually works. You got to pardon me for being so hot and sweaty, but we were looking at 95 degrees here today in central North Carolina, and the humidity is just absolutely awful. And that's just the way it is. But the way the Almanac works is in two different relations that you got to keep in mind. First of all, you got to plant by the signs. There's 3 signs you can plant by, but I only go by 2. And if it gets to the 3rd sign, I'm not going to plant. I just don't trust it that good. Although it says it is a fruitful water sign, it would have to be an absolute last resort. And that's the sign of Pisces. The number 1 sign to plant in is Cancer. The number 2 sign is Scorpio. And number 3, like I said, is Pisces. Now, if you've got an Almanac, we've got a Blum's. That's the brand we use. This is distributed and printed in central North Carolina, up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Now, I've got a few bookmarks here, and the reason I do, I wanted to be able to quickly get you a reference on what I've got here. Let me toss this down. There was some notes in there about the Almanac. And this Almanac, generally, within the first 10 or 12 pages, will give you information about the signs. Now, it says that Scorpio represents the genitals, Cancer represents the chest, breast, and stomach, and I'm looking for Pisces here. There it is, the feet, toes, and the lymphatic system. So that generally gives you a definition of what each thing is in the first 12 to 15 pages. Now, let me get back over here to, there we go. I'm going to show you here in the planting guide. I'm going to try to bring this in close enough to you. But it tells you the signs right there in order. Cancer, Scorpio, Pisces. And then you got 3 on the bottom there. But we're only going to talk about the top 3. Those are the fruitful water signs. And how does this work? These signs have to work with the moon phases. There's 2 phases of the moon. That is the waxing phase, and that means you're increasing light. And there's a waning phase, which means you're decreasing light. The waxing phase begins at the new moon to the full moon, so you're increasing light. The waning phase is from the full moon down to the new moon, and that decreases light. Got to keep that in mind. Those are very important. and I'll tell you why. Have you ever been to the beach and happened to be there on a full moon? If you're there on a full moon, you will notice that the tide is quite a bit higher than it normally is. You just got to be there enough to know where the normal tide level would come and then where a high tide would come on a full moon. Now, we did a video here just a week or two ago called King Tide. I'm going to invite you to look at that. That actually shows the high tide and the information about it. Now, the King Tide was a specific time of the year where the sun and the earth, or the sun and the moon, was relatively close. This time it was the sun and the moon, and it had a significant gravitational pull, and it created the water level to be tremendously more higher than normal, and they call that a king tide. Now, those are predictable, and it happens, like I said, a couple of times of the year. But we're talking about the tide. What happens when the moon is full? The fuller it gets, increasing light, the higher the tide becomes. And on the full moon is the crest, or the biggest, the highest point possible, and that's when the tide's going to be the highest. Now, the moon also affects the water table in the same manner. As the moon increases toward the full moon, the water table in the ground rises. A lot of people don't believe that, but it's true. A lot of times your creek levels and lake levels will rise because it's pulling the water up out of the ground into the creeks and things, and you'll notice an increase in the height of the water in the creek, some ponds, lakes, things like that. It's not a whole lot, but if you're in a place where you can actually get a measurement of when it's say a last quarter moon versus a full moon, and you've not gone through like a 4-week drought or nothing like that, you just had normal rainfall, you will notice this. So what happens when the water table rises as the moon gets fuller, and it goes down further as the moon decreases in the light, in the waning phase? Now, the way this works is you plant your crops by the sign. You want to plant in the sign of Cancer or Scorpio. That's the only two I plant in. And you want to do that between the new moon and the full moon. And the Almanac here will give you pictures of each sign that you want to go by. And Cancer looks like a crab, and Scorpio looks like a scorpion. So that's what you want to look for. For like right now, the month of September is coming, and our above ground crops are going to be planted best on the 7th and the 8th, because that's between the new moon and the full moon. It's almost at the first quarter. Now, your root crops would want to be planted from a full moon through the part of the new moon, and I'll explain that. If you plant your above ground crops during that time in a Cancer sign or a Scorpio sign during the waxing phase of the moon, what happens is by the time that seed germinates and it starts developing its root system, it has cycled through enough that the roots are starting to develop and start going down, and the water table about 30 days later is coming up to meet and give moisture to those roots that are going down, if that makes any sense to you. Now, on a root crop, you would want to plant this opposite, because you got to give the seeds time enough to germinate. Then you got to give it the moisture time to come up to start getting the roots developed, and by the time the cycle runs back around again, your roots are going very deep. During that time of the 30-day cycle, it's searching for water, so your roots are growing down and down and down, trying to get down to moisture. And then the next cycle, you have your water coming up to nourish it, and that way it's kind of a rotational thing. The root crop is actually searching, and that's what you want it to do, search for water after that 30-day plant. And as the roots have already started developing, so you want them to develop and go down. I hope that's making sense to you and I'm not confusing you. So you want to plant in the Cancer sign above ground on the waxing phase. A root crop needs to be planted on the waning phase in the same two signs. Always planting those two signs. Now, if there's in the Almanac, there's also a lot of information about stuff that you're gonna find, and it's got specific information on these areas called living by the signs. So you'll wanna look at this. You can get a Blum's Almanac simply by going online and ordering one. Now, I'm not familiar with the Old Farmer's Almanac. I've always used this almanac because my grandfather used it on both sides, both grandfathers. My dad used it, my father-in-law used it, I use it, and my son used it. And I believe in it so much. And the reason is I have planted in the wrong sign, and all I got was a bunch of blooms and vines, and that was about it. But when I've planted by the sign in the Almanac and went by it exactly, I had so much stuff I didn't know what to do with it. But I hope this has been some good information for you about how to use the Almanac and when to plant. And if you have any comments, by all means leave them. If this video has been helpful to you, please share it. And if you're not a subscriber, hit the subscription button. This is a lot of stuff that we talk about here on Deep River Farm. And that's the critical times to plant. So keep that in mind. You'll be absolutely thrilled with what you do if you'll go buy an almanac. And like I said, I've never used the Old Farmer's Almanac that's available in a lot of Tractor Supplies and places. I've only used the Blum's Almanac because it's a local almanac to me. I appreciate you joining us here today on Deep River Farm, and I hope you have a blessed day.